So I'm going to be talking to you today about purpose. I'm going to be talking about my journey of understanding the science and psychology behind purpose and how it's really, over the last 5 years, really changed how I think about work and a key epiphany about fundamentally what we need to do to fix work. So that's sort of what we're going to try to cover in 40 minutes. Does that sound all right? Up for it? See this thing? Is there a direction? There it is. Perfect. So, as Al mentioned, my journey really begins with the Taproot Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that I founded back in 2001 in San Francisco. And we had a really simple mission, which was that nonprofit organizations, how many of you work at a nonprofit? How many of you have donated or volunteered for a nonprofit? Look at that. So you all know what a nonprofit is. Don't have the marketing, the tech, the HR, the analytics capacity that companies like many of those in the room have, and that they need those to be able to thrive in the modern marketplace. So we set out to figure out how to take what's been very successful in the legal profession, which is the pro bono ethic, this idea that those who need your services but can't afford it should have the ability to have access to it. And let's bring that to marketing. Let's bring that to HR. Let's bring that to tech. And over the course of 12 years, we scaled the organization to the point where we had offices around the country, and then in 30 countries around the world, we had affiliates. We ultimately worked with the White House to build a $15 billion a year market for pro bono services in the US. It was this incredible experience of seeing people at their very best across sectors, working without pay because they were getting something else out of it. It was something that was so pure and was so powerful to them that they were willing to work without pay, which is pretty interesting if you think about it from an analytics standpoint. I left, however, because what we found was that the reason why most people were doing pro bono work was because their work wasn't fulfilling. They weren't getting their needs met at work, so they were going to volunteering to pro bono work. Oh my God, are you okay, sir? That's right. It's a little startling, I think. They weren't finding their work to be meaningful enough. And I realized that what we were doing at Taproot, while really important, we were basically creating a supplement to make up for the fact that people's core meals weren't nutritious. We were in the vitamin business, instead of actually addressing the fact that we need to fix work so that people choose to volunteer, but they don't need to feel like they need to volunteer to be able to fundamentally feel like they have meaning in their lives. Does that surprise anybody in the room, that people were sort of using volunteering that way? There we go again. Maybe it's like behind the back. There it is. It's behind the back. That's the trick. Towards the end of my tenure running the Taproot Foundation, we partnered with Reid Hoffman and the team at LinkedIn to figure out how do we get all the members of LinkedIn to raise their hands and say, I want to do pro bono work. I want to use my professional skills to make a difference. And this just underscores from a data standpoint the point I was just making, which is almost instantaneously, 1 million people raised their hands saying, I want to volunteer, I want to do skill-based volunteering, I want to do pro bono work. But when they looked at the other side, they found only 1% match in terms of nonprofits that actually wanted that help. And what it came to realize was the fact that people were so hungry for meaning at work, and it just reinforced the point that the nonprofit sector can't be the solution for this for everyone in the corporate world. That corporations actually have to address this problem by fixing work itself, not just offering volunteer opportunities. It really may be behind the back. It is. So early on my journey with Imperative, my new company, we partnered with New York University and did a representative sample survey of the US workforce. And what we found was that 66% of people are unfulfilled at work. 66%. And as my cartoonist found out, the cat is actually fulfilled. You see the cat? And this is why I don't like cats. She's like really miserable, and like the cat is somehow happy, which I find highly problematic. But 66% of people are unfulfilled. And this is devastating when you think about what that means in terms of 2 out of 3 people in your office are unfulfilled. Walking down the street, 2 out of 3 people are unfulfilled at work. This is really devastating when you think about what the impact of that is on sort of the soul of our country, the soul of society. This is really fascinating. And as Nicole, my colleague, will attest, work fundamentally isn't working. If 66% of people are unfulfilled, this means that work is fundamentally failing us as a species, as living creatures, that work isn't meeting a critical need in our lives. And this, I believe, is the greatest challenge of our generation, is figuring out how to solve for this. Because the impact of this is far greater than just corporate profits. This is feeding everything, I believe, including our toxic political environment in this country, that when people are so checked out, are so unfulfilled, it's building fear, skepticism, distrust, etc. And this is just fueling bigger and bigger problems in our society. Maybe if I just stand like that. There it is. And what's really interesting that we found was that there's a myth that people have that, like we were seeing with volunteering, your work doesn't have to be fulfilling if you can get your needs for fulfillment elsewhere, right? We hear that advice given in careers all the time, like, your work doesn't have to be everything. You have faith, you have sports, you have your family, etc. What we found in our most recent study was actually the people who report being fulfilled in life. So people said, yes, I'm fulfilled in life. Only 1% said they weren't fulfilled at work. Think about that. What we're really finding is that you're one human being, and you can't be fulfilled in life if you're not fulfilled at work. It's just too big a part of your life. And so much of this is tied to mindset. So it's not like you can suddenly turn this on and off. It's part of who we are as fluid creatures. And this means that the stakes for solving this problem are even greater. Because it's not like we can just say, you know what, screw it. Work's not fulfilling, suck it up. Go to the softball league, go to your church, go to your family, take care of it there, and just take a paycheck. Like, that doesn't fundamentally psychologically work. Look at that. So our goal at Imperative has been, how do we flip this? How do we go from 66% of the workforce unfulfilled to 66% of the workforce fulfilled? And I'm here today to sort of share what we've learned about how to go about doing this and what matters, and the hope to really inspire you to think a little differently about how you're approaching people analytics and how you're thinking about the future of work. I'm going to try this. Well, I don't want to press it twice. I'll go too fast. So some of you may have noticed that I use the word fulfillment instead of engagement. How many of your companies still sort of measure employee engagement or talk about employee engagement? So nearly all of you. I fundamentally believe, and I'm about to share with you why, the framing, not necessarily the measurement, but the framing of employee engagement is a big part of this problem. The fundamental use of that language and the origins of it and what it triggers for people is actually part of the fundamental problem. It's not a measurement issue as much as it is a psychological framing issue, and words, as you all know, do matter. First of all, when we ask people, would you rather have a fulfilling job or an engaging job? Look at how different that is. We as human beings are not looking to be engaged, right? How many of you expect to be on your deathbed 100 years from now, reflecting back on your life and saying, damn, I was engaged, right? That's not how we think. It's not a human-centered perspective on our lives or work. It's a management perspective on what they want human resources to do to produce output. It's not what we actually as creatures want. So first of all, how many of you are hiring people in your organizations? So a couple of you. So maybe if you talked about how fulfilling it is to work at your organization, it might attract more people, given the fact that people overwhelmingly say they want fulfilling jobs over engaging. We still had a lot of naysayers say, that's lovely, but people don't fundamentally understand the difference between engagement and fulfillment. This is just semantics, right? So we asked people to write down, what is engagement, what is fulfillment? And we created these word clouds to show what they reported. So I'm going to pause here. What stands out to people about the difference? I've never used a laser pointer. The difference between engagement and fulfillment. That was fun. Anyone? What do you see? Yes, sir. Emotions. Yep. What else stands out to folks? Satisfaction. What else stands out as different?
The tactical versus the personal emotion.
Yep. Sort of tactical versus human emotion. They're pretty stark differences. I mean, I would say people understand the difference, right? One person said at a conference last year, it's the difference between a human being and a human doing, right? That we've tended to sort of define engagement. It's around a human resource versus a human being. It's around action and task rather than around actually sort of showing up as a actual human being. And that's a fundamental difference. And we've seen this move in the overall marketplace towards human-centered design, human-centered approach to products and services. If we actually take a human-centered approach to the idea of work, it's pretty clear fulfillment is the frame for a human-centered approach to work. Engagement remains a fundamental frame seeing human beings as resources. See, that happened to me. I knew it was. No, there we go. It went back and forth. So here's one of the main differences, and this is really exciting given the field that most of you are in. If you ask people who's responsible for your engagement as an employee, what would you expect people to say? Manager. They say their manager in the organization is responsible for engaging them. That somehow it's something that happens to them. And we use that as a frame, like, you know what, manager, you're not doing a great job of engaging your team, right? That's how that often comes out. When you ask people who's responsible for your fulfillment, the answer is fundamentally different. 68% of people said they're responsible for their own fulfillment. So what's interesting here when you think about going from engagement to fulfillment, it's not just that it's more human-centered, it's not just that it's sort of more progressive, but it actually changes the whole structure of how we think about work and management and culture. Because it goes from a paternalistic model of fundamentally work happening to people and the outcomes happening to people actually acknowledging that it's their responsibility. Think about how fundamentally that is different than the way cultures are today, where so much of it's about what has the organization done for you, why isn't the manager doing a good job of engaging you, to actually being a different question, which is, you know you're responsible for your fulfillment, how can we help? That's a very different question, and it removes a lot of the lack of psychological safety in the workplace, because it becomes about empowering people and not about weaponizing and being able to sort of point at leadership and management and say, why aren't you engaging people? Does that follow? So the key question becomes, for those of you that really care about sort of the actual human beings in your organizations, given the fact that they're saying they're responsible for their own fulfillment, how can employees make their work fulfilling? It's their responsibility, but how can they do it, and how can you as companies help people make their work fulfilling? How many people would like your employees to make their work fulfilling? Half of you? It's pretty good. Take notes for the career fair later. They're out. So here's where we go into neuroscience and what we've learned about what the fundamental issue is around fulfillment at work and what's going on. And this is so critically important because there's a fundamental problem in our workplace right now. We are wired to connect. And I'm sure most of you already know this, but we are fundamentally wired to connect. It is how, when we were in the plains of the Serengeti, we survived, was we needed a community around us. The number one predictor of survival back then was whether or not you were part of a group. We need that to be able to survive. And meaningful conversations are neurologically necessary to process change. How many of you are going through change in your company of some way? Without meaningful conversations, people have a really hard time processing that change without moving into a fear mindset. It's necessary for learning social, soft, power skills, whatever you want to call them. You need meaningful conversation, your brain, to process that kind of content, to learn those types of skills. And you can't fundamentally be fulfilled at work if you don't regularly have meaningful conversations. The problem is meaningful conversations are becoming extinct in the modern workplace. And this is leading to so many of the problems we have in the workplace, ranging from diversity and inclusion issues, psychological safety, collaboration, mental health, all tied back to the fact that we are no longer having meaningful conversations at work. To that point, nearly half of people report suffering from feelings of loneliness. 53% of Americans don't have meaningful daily social interactions at work or at home. Think about that. It's absolutely devastating, and this is getting worse, not better. Why is this so important to business? I want to explain sort of this cycle that happens. So let's say you're lonely. I'm going to pick on you, my friend down here. You're lonely today. I'm sorry. You're at the table by yourself. Soon we'll fix that problem for you. But what's happening to my friend here is, sitting there being lonely, he starts to get stressed. Loneliness leads to stress. And when you're stressed, you start to become anxious. And when you become anxious, it starts to make you depressed. And guess what happens when you are in that state? People don't want to sit next to you. And it just becomes more and more lonely, right? And this is the cycle that gets worse and worse and worse. And this is what's happening in the workplace today. People are feeling lonely, they're getting stressed, they're getting anxious, they're getting depressed. It's getting worse, it's getting worse. And what are the implications? Declining physical health. Research has shown clearly a connection to declining physical health, low energy and productivity, decreased capacity to learn and adapt. So people, when they're lonely and are in this state, they can't learn, they can't adapt because they're in a fear state. And they lack empathy and the ability to collaborate. So we're looking at all these things that come out of analytics, all these problems around productivity, energy, well-being, ability to learn, adapt. So much of that's tied back to the fact that when people don't have meaningful conversations regularly at work, it's putting them in this state of stress, anxiety, and depression. So take that one step further. A study last year found 50% of millennial turnover is now tied to mental health. 50%. Does that surprise folks? It surprised me. I thought it would be high, but 50% kind of blew me away. And then we found out with the next generation, Gen Z, we're already seeing that at 75%. So this is trending like that. Mental health is causing turnover more than any other thing in the workplace. And that makes sense given what we just saw about loneliness, right? That's creating this incredible problem with turnover. 95% of people are reporting symptoms of stress at work. And according to our study, only 33% of people are fulfilled at work. This is a crisis. For those of you who care about retention, for those of you who care about having a healthy workplace, for those of you who care about your siblings, your family, and others who have jobs, this is a fundamental human problem, a fundamental business problem that we have to crack. Part of the reason relationships are so important is that they act as a buffer. How many of you have had a bad day at work? So what happens on the days that you have a bad day at work and the next day you have a good day versus the ones where you continue to have a bad day the next day? Fundamentally, what tends to happen is that you have someone to be able to process what happened that day and to get it off your chest. You know that expression, get it off your chest? You can't get it off your chest talking to yourself, right? Part of what we need to do to process stress, to not let it fester, is we need to be able to talk through it with other people. We need to be able to process what happened during the day to us. We need to process what we're thinking. And when someone's in that environment without meaningful conversation, sitting in a state of fear and anxiety, there's no fundamental buffer being created when there isn't that relationship. And what's happening is that's just hitting people directly. They have no social capability to actually create that buffer so that they can manage that stress, anxiety, and sense of loss. So it's basically just further evidence of how this compounds. And what is the impact, sort of more broadly? Workforce fundamentally is resisting change and not learning. At a time when we need people to be open to change more so than ever, at a time when people need to learn more than ever, we're seeing the opposite happening. We've seen these sort of famous stats. 70% of change fails due to employee resistance. So McKinsey might come in and do a great deck. The CEO, the executive team's we're all in, it's great. Falls flat no matter how good the strategy is because of employee resistance. And we also know that 90% of learning fails as well, which is not surprising given that if most people are operating in this lonely, stress-based state, they may be hearing content, but they're not open to actually learning because their brain is shut off from learning. So this is affecting our ability as we look at the future of work where things are just changing faster and faster. We need people to reskill constantly. Those things are not going to happen unless we address the psychological underpinnings that put people in a position to be able to be open to change and to learn. The true solution to this is meaningful conversations. We've got an endangered species on our hands, the meaningful conversation at work, and we need to figure out a way to revive them and to bring them back into work. Things like Slack, things like 15-minute meetings, the level of transactional business interaction we have at work, these things are all pushing meaningful conversations out of work. What we are doing is engineering the humanity out of work to enable us to be more efficient. But oddly enough, it's having a negative impact because we're not addressing the psychology of it, and we're just going to hit a wall where people are operating in such stress, such fear, that no matter what we do, they're just going to fundamentally be stuck. So HR tech has done a lot of great stuff, right? From analytics, we've got also the ability to push out content to people really efficiently. We can manage tasks like a motherfucker. We can just manage tasks online through all kinds of project management software. We can create really cool things like decks. It's great for human doing. We have mastered, in many ways, HR tech for human doing and for human resources. What we haven't done is figured out how to create technology to address the needs of human beings. We haven't created technology that truly helps people align with each other and their company. We haven't created technology that helps people with positive emotion and mindset. And we haven't helped people fundamentally connect. We've been able to connect in the sense that they know each other's contact information, but to actually see each other, to truly feel seen, technology is actually making that harder and harder as it is today. And we believe the next sort of generation of HR tech needs to address how do we unleash this human being component, not just the human doing. What we have been building, which I shared earlier, we just got venture backing for, which I'm really excited about. The future of work really to us is about a human being API, right? So if you think about an API, right? So think about Google Maps and something like Uber, where there's an API in the back that enables these two apps to talk to each other and to seamlessly sort of share information to support each other, right? The challenge we have is that the human brain, if you think about it as a computer, the API needed to actually effectively talk to the brain about things like change, to talk to them about things like relationships, to talk to them about learning, requires a different API to the brain than just pure content pushing or task management. It fundamentally requires a different model of engagement. And the key to that is really around the fact that a human being has to be sort of between the computer and the other human being, because we need that meaningful conversation to be how that information is transmitted. It can't be transmitted by just pure text. It can't just be transmitted through someone standing up on stage like myself. It needs to be transmitted through a level of intimate conversation for our brain to actually hear it. What happens when we create sort of a fulfillment operating system? So if we think about, we create that API so you actually can have that connection, and you have people connecting through what we call peer coaching. People's ability to regularly have conversations that help them process change, learn new skills, and sort of adapt to their environment. What you start to see in this environment with peer coaching, where it's built into the culture, is you start to see the human being attributes starting to pop. You see self-improvement and learning happening. You see trust and safety, because suddenly you feel seen, you feel appreciated, et cetera. Self-esteem goes up, right? People's sense of immunity and well-being goes up. Their sense of fulfillment goes up. They become more adaptable. They develop empathy, which is critical in today's workforce, and they become more productive as a result of all of that. So when we're starting to actually build a culture where we bring meaningful conversation intentionally back into a workplace, that's what's going to achieve all these goals. And I know at most of your companies, these are the things that are being sort of asked, like how do we improve trust and safety? There's not psychological safety in our workplace. How do we improve empathy? How do we improve well-being? You can't do that through most of the current technology means or ways that companies are doing interventions. It has to be done through human-to-human meaningful conversation. That is the API for creating that kind of change. Nothing else works given the way our brain is wired. A big part of this challenge, though, especially in large organizations like many of yours, is that we actually have a firewall between ourselves and the rest of the world, right? So I'm carrying this metaphor forward. We have a firewall that requires a password to be able to get into our brain, to have the trust, to be able to actually have this kind of conversation. You can't just jump into this conversation with a stranger if you don't first have trust. It operates as a firewall. And unfortunately, the way our brains are wired from way back when is that when we see someone, when we meet someone, we immediately classify them as a friend or a foe. We needed that for survival back in the day, and we're wired to immediately do that. And this is critical, because if you get triggered as a friend, you're in the firewall. If you get triggered as a foe, you're not getting in past that firewall. And if you're labeled as a friend, you become supportive, you have collaborative behavior, and you have empathy. If you're a foe, you immediately go into a competitive mindset, fear-based behavior, and you're actually not mentally capable of having empathy. And I'm going to give the most basic example I always give, which is not always popular, but I'm a big Yankees fan. That's the part that's not popular. When a Yankee fan does something that's like not super great, I still forgive them because they're a Yankee fan and therefore they're my friend. When I see a Red Sox fan do the exact same thing, I think they should be jailed for life. Like I have an emotional, visceral reaction to that exact same activity, thinking like that is a bad human being, even though my Yankee colleague did the exact same goddamn thing, right? That's an example of this where I'm just triggering based on the fact that we're wearing the same hat, this idea of friend or foe. That could be the same for you this weekend with the Niners. We all have these sort of tribal things where if we see someone wearing something connected to something we care about, you trigger that friend and you start to positively associate behavior with them. Whereas if you label them as foe, you're immediately basically like shooting them down. Does that resonate? I see a couple heads nodding. So why is that? When we see someone as a friend, our brain actually has something called wiring, or a mirroring that happens. And the idea here is that if I saw one of my Yankee fans hurt themselves, my brain would actually trigger similar chemicals to as if I had hurt myself. We actually build empathy in our brain when we see people that we label as friend, because it's part of how we protect our tribe. But when we label someone as foe, that doesn't get triggered. So even though someone might be hurt, we don't actually feel much empathy or any for them, because we're not actually putting them in that category and firing the same neurochemicals that we would. So the key question is, how do we get through this firewall? How can you help people in your organization have meaningful conversations by getting through this firewall into the way their brains work? And the Heath brothers wrote a great book called The Power of Moments. How many of you read The Power of Moments? One. How many of you should read The Power of Moments? So in the book, among many things, they talk about, what is it that enables you to feel like someone's a friend? What is it that actually triggers the sense of labeling someone a friend? The first thing is shared experiences. So you're all in here with a shared experience. That's going to immediately make you more open when you see each other to say, hey, how are you doing? And feel like they're actually a friend, because you have a shared experience, which makes you feel safer and more likely to be part of your tribe. Personal conversations. The more you can have truly personal conversations, the more likely you are to see someone as a friend. And they've been shown to also find, and this goes back to my original work, purpose. When people are in a purpose mindset, when people are in a mindset of thinking about themselves at their best, when they're thinking about themselves in service to others, it actually releases oxytocin that makes you more open to seeing someone as a friend. So what is a personal conversation? A lot of people get confused. I talk about like meaningful conversations, personal conversations. What does that actually mean? A personal conversation involves reflection and insights. So it's actually being able to do personal reflection and being able to spark insights between people where you're creating new value through an insight. That is a meaningful conversation. Did you deliver your product on time is not a meaningful conversation. How did it feel to slip the date? And what do you feel like you want to do to sort of address the emotional charge of that? That's a meaningful conversation. It's stories. We are wired, as we all know, to really understand and be able to connect to people meaningfully when there's stories shared. Creating the space for people to actually tell stories. And then shared problem solving. Being able to sort of help each other solve challenges helps you create a meaningful conversation. And these all produce oxytocin when you're doing these things. What are the two other things that produce oxytocin? Sex, nursing. Just think about how powerful they are as bonding agents, right? Personal conversations do the same thing when we're actually able to do that. And that's what makes us feel comfortable with someone, is we're actually getting a chemical firing saying, trust this person, feel a sense of connection to them, want to stay in their orbit. But what's required to do this, we're finding, is a whole new programming language. We've been building programming languages for software, but what we're actually finding is that to be able to have that API work, where you're actually able to talk to your brain, to be able to help it address these issues, there are certain ways in which we need to set up language between people to actually enable them to have a meaningful conversation and to amplify that. And the Heath brothers do a great job of describing this too. There's sort of three core things they talk about. One is understanding. So how do you create language? How do you create interactions where someone is going to report at the end, my partner knows how I see myself and what is important to me? How many times have you had a conversation at work where that's happened? Like, that's incredibly rare. Validation. My partner respects who I am and what I want. I find in the workplace in general, most people have no idea what their colleagues actually want, and they don't actually really respect who they are because they don't actually understand what they want in the first place. So there's a lack of understanding and a lack of validation, and that leads to the third, which is caring. My partner takes active and supportive steps in helping me meet my needs. So when we're able to actually build the capacity for people to have conversations that force them to be able to communicate with understanding, to validate each other and show caring, that's when we're having this incredible magic happen between people. But the reality is most people no longer know how to have these kinds of conversations. And we need to really build this back into the capacity of people to learn how to talk to each other again. And I see this, like I have an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old, and it is really hard to have a meaningful conversation with them. They're constantly on technology. They're a classic teenager of like answering every question with, okay, what have you. We actually are finding like these future generations that are coming in the workplace are getting worse and worse at actually having meaningful conversation. The great news is, though, that when we surveyed American workers, 90% said, though, they'd be open to coaching their colleagues. They'd be open to being in a coaching relationship, having these kinds of conversations. So you're sitting on an incredible resource inside your company. 90% of your people are willing to operate as sort of coaches with each other to do this work. I talk about it as like Airbnb, right? Airbnb didn't create new hotels, and it didn't create a fancy new algorithm to find hotel rooms. They took inventory that was out there in every house and turned that into an asset, right? And this is the opportunity here for our cultures. 90% of our people are willing to be part of this. They're willing to be turned on to help turn on other people. And we need to figure out how to do that so that we can turn around this vicious negative cycle in the workplace. What we've built, and I don't want to spend much time on that, but I just want to explain this to you just to understand the technology and the concept. What we've developed is a platform that enables people to psychologically determine what brings fulfillment and meaning to their work, so they have that self-awareness about what matters. And then we also have a whole library of these conversations that are in this peer coaching programming language that are set up based on a topic to have them ask the right questions of each other so that they actually can go through the psychological process of having that meaningful connection and having those major learning and adaptation objectives happen. We then have an engine that combines those two, and we use the psychological purpose profile of each employee to match them with the right other employee to have the conversation, and then dynamically adapt the scripts so they're personalized. So as you're asking each other questions over a video conference, it's telling you what questions to ask each other, and they're customized based on what we know from your purpose psychographics are going to be the questions that are going to elicit the right response from that person to feel seen and to feel connected. So it's basically creating, I think of it as having like an AI coach whispering behind each of two people, telling them what to ask each other so they truly have that sense of connection. And then at the end, we're able to measure outcomes. We're able to measure whether or not people actually feel connected to someone, whether or not they feel like they're open to the change, whether or not they have adopted a new corporate value and truly get what it means, et cetera. So we can actually start to see, is this working? Are people reporting that it's making a difference in terms of their mental health, their stress, anxiety, et cetera? What we've seen so far, and we're just really early in our journey, after people did 3 of these peer coaching sessions, they sat down for about an hour 3 times with another person on our platform, 90% said it positively changed their work. 90%. 87% said it was increasing their fulfillment at work. And 92% said they desired to continue doing peer coaching after 3 conversations. And this is not shocking. We know this based on neuroscience. People change behavior when you're doing this kind of work where you're actually able to process and to have address the emotional and identity work that needs to happen related to a change in behavior. We know that people don't have meaningful conversations to suddenly spend 3 hours over the course of time with someone and to truly feel seen. We hear this over and over again. I've been working with this guy for 10 years and I didn't know any of this stuff about him. I finally feel like I get this person. Like that feels awesome to feel seen like that. So few of us get that sort of sense. And why wouldn't you want to continue to have meaningful conversations? I do peer coaching probably once a week now. It is by far the best part of my week. It is the time that I feel seen, someone else. I feel like a sense of energy that comes out of it. I feel human versus just sort of on my task engine. It is incredible what a drug talking to someone and having a real conversation is. As we think about the future of work and think about how we can start to build meaningful conversation, peer coaching into our work, I want to just share a couple applications. Transitions. Imagine if every new employee in your company in their first 3 months got connected to another new employee and they operated as peer coaches for each other, supporting each other through that transition time, making them feel like they're not alone, sharing their emotional experience as they're going through starting at that organization, starting to truly understand the values of the company, truly understanding the purpose of the company. Or a new manager. One of the most stressful transitions in your career is when you go from individual contributor to manager. Imagine having another manager who's going through that same experience there to be able to once a week talk through what's going on and process that experience of being a new manager. For L&D, we've been doing all kinds of learning and development investments around online learning, but they're all around pushing content back and forth, by and large. Being able to actually teach things like unconscious bias. You can't teach that through reading a paper. It actually requires meaningful conversation to process and to truly own something like unconscious bias or empathy. For tune-ups, Imagine if people once a month, once a quarter, are sitting down, not with their manager, not with HR, but with just a colleague and saying, how am I doing? How is my level of fulfillment? What are the things I want to do more of? And be thoughtful about it in a non-risk, non-stress environment, which is very different than doing it with your manager. And then finally, culture. Change management. Companies are constantly changing. How do you inform people about a change? An all hands and an email and maybe some posters on the wall, right? What if you actually had people deploy conversations so that within one day of a change, everyone in the company has had a conversation to very intentionally see how that change benefits them and to emotionally process it and see someone else positively emotionally respond to it? You suddenly have not only understanding, but actual change happening because people feel ownership of it. This is why peer coaching really is the API to address the biggest challenges that we have in the workplace today. And measuring them is critical, but after we measure them and see that we don't have empathy, we have mental health issues, we need to do something about it. We can't just be measuring it. And this is the way we go from measuring and identifying the challenges to actually solving for it, is helping to create this API between all of your employees. So just in closing, I wanted to just share with you, we have two research papers available on imperative.com, and my colleague Nicole next door has a bunch of them printed out as well. But we have a guide that really goes through all the known research about peer coaching and everything I've shared times 10 that's available in case you're interested in learning more about the science and the history of how the US Army has deployed this and others, outside of Imperative, but just how they've used peer coaching as a way to transform culture, as well as our 2019 annual measurement of fulfillment in the workplace and what we've learned. I'm all about sharing this knowledge. It's going to take all of us innovating to figure out how to solve this. And just in closing, I want to challenge all of you to be courageous. I want you to think about engagement versus fulfillment and how you want to think about how that's landing with people. And is it aligned with your values? Do you want to see people as human resources or human beings? I want you to really think about how are you creating that API between people to have them truly connect as human beings? Because if we do those, we are going to have a radically different society very quickly, and the future of work will be incredibly positive. With that, I don't know where we are with time, but
we're perfect, actually. Aaron,
thank you.
Fantastic. That was